Chronicles is all about the good parts. If there's one thing to remember, it's good parts when it comes to Chronicles. Because in a lot of ways, 1st and 2nd Chronicles can feel like a repeat of 1st and 2nd Kings with different emphasis. And part of that emphasis is goodness, the goodness of God, the faithfulness of God. So Chronicles is the good parts from Adam all the way in the Garden of Eden to the exile, or really the return from exile, when the Jewish people will get to come back to their homeland. And so with that in mind, I wanted to read Philippians 4:8, which Daniel, I know you have for me, so you can go ahead and read that, Daniel.
Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things.
Awesome. Yeah. So God wants us to think and meditate on the things that are good, because God is only good. There's no evil in God whatsoever. And then Michael has Romans 12, verse 21.
Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good.
That's right. Don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. So Chronicles is all about seeing God's goodness in everything that is happening in the Bible story. And a lot of it is really summarized. I know I say it goes back to Adam, but really the main focus in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is that period of Kings, but focusing on the good parts of that. So if you look at the outline, the reason I'm doing a PowerPoint again for Chronicles is because really, when it comes to 1st and 2nd Kings, I put the emphasis more on Israel, because in the Bible, Israel is Israel's going to become lost. We talked about how Israel becomes lost. And when I say Israel, I'm talking about the northern kingdom. But the southern kingdom isn't as focused on in 1st and 2nd Kings. So Chronicles comes in and really focuses on just the southern kingdom, just the kingdom of Judah. And so all I'm going to say regarding the outline, I'm not going to read it like I normally do for all. This is just a very brief summary, but we're going to go into the details of all this in this PowerPoint. But I want to make a brief note about how 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles relate to Ezra and Nehemiah, which we'll talk about 2 weeks from tonight. So Ezra is the spiritual side of the Jews returning to Jerusalem when they come back from exile. And Nehemiah is the political or more city, I don't want to say worldly, but the more just practical political side of things. And so Nehemiah goes with 1st and 2nd Kings, because 1st and 2nd Kings is really more political and more historical, just talking about what's happening. And Ezra goes with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which we're talking about tonight, because 1st and 2nd Chronicles is more spiritual and more focused on God. A lot of people believe that Ezra is actually the one who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and so it's probably the last thing that was written in the Old Testament by Ezra. But the history side of it really focuses mainly on the same stuff we talked about already, but from a different perspective. And so I'll read the verses as well at the bottom. For 1st Chronicles in chapter 16, verse 22, Yahweh's speaking to the nations here through one of his prophets. He's speaking to all the other nations about his chosen people, Israel, or Judah. Do not touch my messiahs, and in Greek it's Christ, and against my prophets do no evil. So in this way, he's saying that all the chosen people are collectively the Messiah. And so there's a truth in that. They're all the body of the Messiah. There's a truth in that shown there. And so then in 2nd Chronicles, chapter 16, verse 9, or really the first part of verse 9, this is part of Hanani the seer's going to give this rebuke to King Asa, who starts off really good, like Solomon, but then he has a bad ending because he starts relying on worldly alliances and politics more than God. And so in criticizing him for this, Hanani says, "The eyes of Yahweh move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." And then in 2nd Chronicles 20, the second part of verse 12, King Jehoshaphat is praying to God, to Yahweh, when Judah was surrounded by these foes. And Jehoshaphat is Asa's son, but he does a better job than Asa does. He turns around some of the things his father's doing. Not perfectly, though. We'll talk about his shortcomings. But in this particular situation, he was seeking God, and he says, we do not know what we should do. They're surrounded by enemies. We do not know what we should do, but our eyes are on you. I love that verse. And so sometimes we don't know what we should do, but we need to always keep our eyes fixed on the Lord in everything. So with that, we go into just a brief review. Remember, what is the difference between an Israelite and a Jew? All Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. And so, remember, the northern kingdom is this green up here, and the southern kingdom is down here. The northern kingdom is Israel. So when we're talking about Israel at this point in history, we're no longer talking about all the 12 tribes of Israel. We're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, which is only 10 of the tribes. The other 2 tribes are down here in the southern kingdom, which is now called Judah. And then I talked about the origin of how in 2 Kings chapter 16, it talks about the Judeans for the first time during the time of King Ahaz. And you could translate this as Jews, but Judeans is one of the ways to translate it. And so we see that by that time there was this separate identity of being Jewish, which is different than being from Israel. And really, though, the Jewish people are all of Israel who's going to be obedient to God. That's what Chronicles is going to show us. Chronicles shows us that the Israel in the north, they completely rejected God, and it didn't even matter anymore. They were just basically like the Gentiles, like all the other nations. So this is all the different ways the word Jew could be rendered, or the word for the Hebrew word is Yehudi, Judean, or Judeans, Jew or Jews, or the Jewish people. The only reason some people don't want to say Jew is because that can be a derogatory term. You don't want to be like that. So there's non-Jewish Israelites in the north and the Jewish people in the south. Okay, so throughout their turbulent history, many Israelites that were in the northern kingdom became refugees and ran south to Judah, where they became Jewish people. For this reason, all 12 tribes of Israel are represented among the Jewish people going into the future. And this also happened when the Jewish people were exiled from Judah to Babylon, because actually when the Assyrians came in and they conquered northern Israel, they carried away the most influential Israelites captive to Babylon. And Babylon wasn't the center of the Assyrian Empire. Their capital was in Nineveh, but they put a ton of Israelites in Babylon, which is interesting because in the future, a couple hundred years basically later, not much longer, the Jewish people are going to be exiled to Babylon, and so they're going to meet up with a bunch of their old Israelite neighbors, and then Israelites there who kept their identity in Babylon are going to join the Jewish people in Babylon also. But many of the poorest Israelites, the ones the Assyrians didn't want to move, or that they just felt bad for them because they were just poor farmers or starving, or like we would think of homeless or whatever, they just left them there in the land, and they mixed together with other Gentiles that the Assyrians brought in from these other nations to the northern territory that used to be Israel. And so these people get mixed, and the story of this is in 2 Kings chapter 17, but they get mixed and they become a new group of people called Samaritans. And so Good Samaritan does not mean a good person who gives to charity. Most people don't know this. Even Google doesn't know this very well. If you Google Samaritan, all these organizations of charity are going to come up. They don't know anything. People don't know about the Samaritans. And it's really sad because it's so important for the history of the Bible, understanding the Samaritans. Because today there's only 840 Samaritans left, at least as of 2021. And they're almost totally extinct. All those that are left live in Israel and in Palestine, in those two places today. This is a picture of them. You can see one of their high priests there holding up their scroll. That is the Torah. That's the books of Moses, but they have their version of it. The only difference is that when they read about the place that God chose to worship him, they think of Mount Gerizim and not Jerusalem. This is the symbol of the Samaritans today. It looks like a fire, but it's actually the old Hebrew characters for the Shema. Like, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God. That whole thing. So Israeli Jewish people today use the modern Hebrew alphabet, which starts over here with Aleph, and it goes from right to left, ending with Tav here. And this is Hebrew, modern Hebrew, but it's because of the Samaritans, in part, there's other reasons too, archaeology and stuff, but that we know that Hebrew didn't always look like this. Hebrew used to look like what the Samaritans used, which is this alphabet. The Samaritan Torah uses this same writing still, even after all these years, thousands of years. And so Aleph again up here and ending with Tav, but it looks very different, as you can see, than modern Hebrew does. But that's what all Hebrew used to look like. And so back at the end of the Old Testament times, they've developed these two different groups of people that are going to be very important to understand going into the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, you're going to have the Samaritans, and they're going to be associated with what used to be northern Israel and Samaria. And Samaria is still around, it's still their city. But then you're going to have the Jewish people who are going to be associated with Judea, which is a province of different empires, and sometimes independent country. And then their capital city is Jerusalem. And they're going to hate each other. And this is important to understand. So the reason Jesus told that story about the Good Samaritan is to say that someone that you hate, that you think that could never be a good person, they can be a good person. That's the point of the story. So if you were to tell the story of the Good Samaritan today, like to an American, you would maybe say,
A Mexican.
yeah, the good Mexican or the good Middle Eastern, depending on which American you're talking to, right? Or the good
Russian.
The good Russian. Yeah, exactly.
The good Chinese person that runs TikTok.
Yeah. The good
Americans
communist.
actually, I realize Americans actually don't
Maybe
know
you
that.
would say the good communist. I mean, that's a little more political. But the point is, someone that you hate, that you think, oh, I despise that person for political reasons. You hate this person. No, they can be good and actually do what pleases God. That's the point of the Good Samaritan story. And most Christians sadly just don't know that because of the lost context of everything. But it's important to understand for the sake of Chronicles that the northern kingdom, Israel, is now the bad guys of history. So from their perspective, there's nothing good about that northern kingdom. They were lost for a reason. God got rid of them. The good guys is the Jewish people. The Jewish people are officially the good guys of history now. And all the Israelites that were good, they joined the Jewish people. So Chronicles focuses on only the Jewish people, not the northern kingdom. It only focuses on Judah and the kings of Judah. I gave you guys this chart, and it doesn't focus on any of these kings. Some of them are mentioned, but they're only mentioned as to how they related with these guys, and they're the focus, just the line of David. And so Chronicles begins using 10 chapters of centuries of just names, fathers and sons, and genealogies going all the way back to Adam in the Garden of Eden to the end of King Saul. And it doesn't tell the whole story of King Saul. It just talks about the very end of his life and how he fails, basically, as king of Israel, and then setting it up for David. So the idea is that all of history, from the very beginning of creation, is building up to King David. And that's now the center of history is David. And in my opinion, some Christians hate Leviticus. They think Leviticus is the most boring book of the Bible. And we shouldn't criticize any book of the Bible, but we all have that part of us where certain parts of the Bible are harder to read. And for me, when I was reading the Bible, the hardest part to get through, and I think I've only gone through it in totality, I've gone through individual verses more than once, but I think I've only gone through it in totality one time, is First Chronicles chapters 1 through 10. And the reason is because it's just so boring. It's literally just reading names. Adam, Seth, literally for 10 chapters of just names. But when I was in school, they were saying that the more bored you feel when you're reading this, the more faithful God is. And I thought that was a really cool point because it's true. God sustained all these people through all their failings. He was still faithful to them. And so then it gets to King David, and here's where our story really picks up. This is the history of Judah, the southern kingdom, from David until the Jewish people are going to get to return from their exile. So beginning with King David, we have the good parts of David. Again, this is the good parts. So he conquered the fortress of Zion in Jerusalem, making it the capital city of Israel, and building it up as the city of David. He led an expert military force that included many Gentiles through contracts. And these were David's mighty men, but a lot of them were Gentiles, maybe even the majority. Helping him slay many giants and establish Israel as an international empire during his lifetime and shortly afterwards. So David becomes the standard for success for every future king of Judah. And so he established Jerusalem as the holy city by bringing Yahweh's tent and the Ark of the Covenant to Mount Moriah, which was the place where Abraham offered Isaac to be sacrificed. But he didn't. The Lord stopped him and provided the ram. And this is the future site where they will build the temple. And then he honored and organized the Levites, who God chose to serve him, and gave them many different jobs to do, to worship Yahweh and lead the Israelites in holiness, setting the Levites up to be the priesthood, but not just the priesthood, the musicians and the scribes, the people who kept track of all the records and everything. And then he planned the building of Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, leading to God establishing an eternal covenant with David's lineage, that an eternal king over all Israel will come from David. And this figure is going to be the Messiah, which is God's eternal human king over Israel. And not because there's messiahs of each generation, like we talked about before, but now in the future, once the temple's destroyed, the Jews are going to be looking forward to one Messiah who's going to be the final Messiah that God has chosen to really bring God's kingdom to the world. So there's this major shift in the story of David that we need to talk about. It's this perspective on God's anger, and now that idea of being acquainted with Satan now, and this shift in Jewish thought. It's a major theological shift. So if you read 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, you'll see that God's anger is kindled against David, and this is what moves David to do the census over Israel. And it's a sin for David to do a census. It was a bad thing because it meant he was going to raise the people's taxes and stuff. But then we read the same exact story in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. It says, Satan stood against Israel. And Satan here is actually a proper name. It's the only time in the Old Testament where Satan in Hebrew is a proper name. Because normally it's the Satan. It's not a name. But here in 1 Chronicles, Satan becomes this name, this figure. Satan stood against Israel. And so what it's saying there is that what was once seen as God's anger or his punishment for sin is now being seen as Satan, this divine enemy that stands against the people of God, wants to destroy the people of God, hates the people of God. And this is still taught in Jewish Kabbalah today. They talk about 10 emanations, and I'm not saying Kabbalah is true, but I just think it's interesting on this point. The fifth emanation, they call it God's left hand, as opposed to like the right hand. This is a good thing. And it's God's severity or God's anger, when God does things in the Old Testament that make people uncomfortable, the violence and all that. They equate this with the angels that are known as the seraphim, which is the serpents, and they also equate it with the idea of Satan, or the devil, or the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And so very interesting theological shift. And so from now on, there's going to be that perspective that there's this divine enemy standing against the people of God. And that perspective just wasn't that strong before. Not that it wasn't there at all, but it was expressed very differently. And it would take too long to go into what I mean by that, so I'll just leave it at that for there. And then if we have time tonight at the end, I can explore that a little more. So King Solomon. The good parts of Solomon. Notice that we skipped over Bathsheba and the bad things David did because we're focusing on the good parts of what happened. So Solomon continued to honor the Levites in their position before God. He organized the Levites and gave them detailed jobs. He set up musicians for continual worship day and night, 24/7 in the temple in Jerusalem. And he set up temple guardians to protect the tithes. The people gave tithes. This is basically the Israelite taxes to support, basically to show their love for God, but also to support the Levites. And then there were temple maintenance workers, janitors and gardeners. And then Solomon established a new pro-Israelite government administration because his administration had a lot of Gentiles in it, and this wasn't popular with some of the people. So he establishes this pro-Israelite administration that has a lot of new scribes and administrators over this forced labor tax. And he modernized the Israelite military with chariots, and he put new cities all over the land. So he did a lot of building and made Israel more modern. Because even though David had an empire, it was kind of old style, and Solomon was trying to make things keep up with the technology of the times. So he carried out David's plan for the temple in Jerusalem and led the Israelites in devotion to Yahweh alone at the beginning. Yahweh responded by filling the temple in Jerusalem with his glory, so much so that the priests couldn't even stand to minister in the temple. They were just like knocked off on their feet or just pushed out of the temple because the glory of God filled Solomon's temple. And then in this context, Solomon blessed and prayed for all the Israelites as they were all gathered together in Jerusalem in this glorious moment. And then through his wisdom, he multiplied wealth in Israel and had this amazing zoo with all these cool animals. And all the nations from all around the world came to see Solomon and the glory of God in Jerusalem. And that's the good parts of Solomon. Again, we're not talking about any of the bad stuff. This is the good parts. So then he has the son, King Rehoboam. And even though he was foolish and it divided Israel, God was doing this to humble the line of David and the kingdom of Judah because he loves them. And God disciplines those he loves. And some Israelites still lived in the cities of Judah and supported Judah. Not all the Israelites abandoned Judah. In fact, the entire tribe of Benjamin and all the Levites supported Judah and moved down south. And then Rehoboam himself actually humbled himself and listened to this prophet named Shemaiah when he had these plans to try to go to war with the northern Israel. He was going to start this war to try to take back what he thought belonged to him. But he humbled himself when the prophet spoke to him and didn't do that. And then he built 15 fortified cities to protect his people from their enemies. And unlike King Jeroboam in the north, he never rejected the Levites. The Levites from the north all moved down into Judah because Jeroboam was like, anybody can be a priest. Like God chose the Levites, Moses made that clear, but Jeroboam was like, no, forget that. Levites, you're out of a job. And they didn't have any land or anything. So the only way they had any sort of income or support was from serving God and being blessed by the people. Well, Jeroboam didn't care about them. But Rehoboam welcomed all the Levites to come and move into Judah and be supported there and serve God there. And so this honored Yahweh and his temple in Jerusalem. And then through his through his discernment and God's gift of 78 women, because the king still had a lot of wives, he had 28 sons, and he gave them leadership positions and established the nobility of Judah. So from now on, there's going to be all this nobility in Judah, and these are all descendants of David, but they're not kings. They're just like, like other kings have established a nobility, lords and ladies and that kind of thing. And he set them over the cities so that it keeps David's line strong. But then at the end, sadly, he became prideful. He started out humble and listened to the prophet, but then he changes his mind, gets prideful, and he goes to war with King Jeroboam, like God had told him not to. And because of that, God humbles both Jeroboam and Rehoboam by sending this Egyptian pharaoh named Shishak to plunder both of them. And he ravages both of their cities, both of their countries, Israel in the north is just completely humiliated, even more than Judah. But then Judah is forced to give all these riches from the temple to Shishak, and then they become a vassal to Egypt for that generation, but just for that generation. And I should comment for a second on what a vassal is. So if a country becomes a vassal to another country, it means that in the case of Judah, for example, they had to pay taxes to Egypt, is what it means. So it's like they're a separate country, they have their own kings, but they have to pay taxes to Egypt. So it's very humiliating. It's like it takes away your independence, but not completely. You still have some independence. Why I'm explaining that is because they're going to become vassals a lot. But this is the first time it happens to Egypt. Just for that generation, though, because after Shishak, Egypt's going to go into civil wars, and they're going to fall apart, and then Judah's going to be free again. So Rehoboam's son is King Abijah. And once again, if it's black, it means they weren't really a king whose heart was fully for God, but it doesn't mean they didn't do anything good. Part of the point of Chronicles is that even if a king's heart wasn't fully for God, they still did good things. And so with Abijah, again, he never forsook the Levites, unlike Jeroboam. He gives this epic speech about how we honor the Lord, we honor the Levites who are chosen to serve him, and because of that, God is with us, Abijah says. And in this situation where Jeroboam is coming to war with Abijah, Judah is actually outnumbered 2-1. But he still defeats Jeroboam and northern Israel in this battle with miraculous help from God. And so Abijah and his army of Jewish people kill 500,000 Israelites from the north as they run away back to the northern kingdom. And Jeroboam is absolutely humiliated. And this is part of the reason we learn in Chronicles that he was rejected. Because remember, he has this treacherous military general who's going to come in and kill his son. Well, it's because they're pissed off.
Over and over.
He's just a complete loser, Jeroboam. And this is part of the reason why. So he captured the city of Bethel, Abijah did, which, remember, Jeroboam had set up a golden calf at Bethel, and then another one way up at Dan. But he captures Bethel, and then he, later, not him, but later they're going to destroy the golden calf because now Judah will now own Bethel. And they also capture other cities from the northern kingdom and bring them into Judah. And in addition to all these things, Abijah has 21 sons through his 14 wives. And then his son is King Asa, who is a good king. But what you're going to see here is this theme of a lot of these kings. They have a very strong start, like Solomon, but they have kind of bad things that happen at the end. A lot of them. Asa is one of these. And so, first of all, again, he honored the Levites. He returned Judah to pure worship of Yahweh only. No more high places in Judah. No more Asherah poles. They were taken down. He removed the cult. There was this cult of the Queen Mother, which was actually his mother, where they would worship this human woman as like a goddess, as a representative of the goddess Asherah. It was just a pagan thing that had come into Judah through Solomon. Remember, Solomon brought it in. It doesn't mention that in Chronicles, and it was continued, but Asa got rid of that. And then he ushered in this era of 10 years of peace and prosperity for Judah, built many fortified cities and expanded Judah's borders, and he also purified Bethel. He destroyed the golden calf thing that was going on. And he built up a huge military force for Judah and won a great victory against the Ethiopians with Yahweh's help, and he expands Judah again. So Judah's getting greater. And so he led many new Israelites in the expanded territory. Specifically, it mentions Israelites from the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon joined Judah and become part of the kingdom of Judah. And he did not remove all the high places, though, in the new Israelite territory. It mentions that. And then at the end of his life, he makes this unholy alliance with the nation of Aram. Because what happens is this other king in Israel, remember the treacherous military general who kills Jeroboam's son, Baasha? Well, he gets angry because all these Israelites are leaving the north and coming down into Judah and becoming part of the Jewish people. And he doesn't like that, so he builds this like wall basically to prevent Israelite refugees from coming down to Judah. And so because of this, Asa doesn't like that. He decides, you know what, I'm going to make an alliance with this nation called Aram. And Aram, if we're on a map, right, and if Judah's way down here in the south, Israel's here in the north, Aram is above Israel, so it's like the north-north. So they make this nation with Aram to try to attack Israel from both sides. That's the idea politically. It's a good political idea, right? Seems good. But Hanani the seer, one of Yahweh's prophets, comes and speaks against this alliance with Aram and basically says, you're relying on men instead of God. Right? You started off so good. Why are you doing this now? And instead of humbling himself when the prophet comes to speak with him, King Asa says, forget you, you're stupid, and he puts him in prison. Because of this alliance with Aram, Aram then says, you know what? You're going to pay us taxes now. And so they become a vassal to Aram because of King Asa's decision. And then he puts this guy in prison. He doesn't kill him, but he puts him in prison for the rest of his life. And so at the end of King Asa's life, he becomes diseased in his feet. And instead of seeking God for healing, he seeks all these doctors for help. And he never gets healed, and he dies from this disease in his feet. And his son is King Jehoshaphat, another good king. So he builds fortified cities in the new northern territory of Judah to keep the southern kingdom strong. And he brings in more Ephraimites, people from the tribe of Ephraim. He honors the Levites and sent them with other officials to teach Yahweh's Torah to all Israelites within the borders of Judah. He removed the high places from Judah, which had been set back up at the end of his father's reign. So Asa, at the end of his reign, kind of relented and let the people go build the high places again. And this is places where they would worship Yahweh, but also many other gods. But sadly, they were all rebuilt at the end of his reign. So Jehoshaphat also, by the end of his reign, allows the people. It's not always just the king. Sometimes the people would pressure the king. You're going to see this in the story. But he established great wealth and a powerful military through his fame, spreading to all nations around Judah. And he enforced righteousness by establishing just courts led by Levites and other qualified men who knew Yahweh's Torah and would not take bribes or act corruptly. And when an alliance of Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites gathered against Judah, he led Judah in faith and praise to Yahweh. And basically, there's this situation where the people are surrounded, but God tells them through this Levite prophet named Jazael that they should just worship God. They shouldn't even fight. They should just worship God, and God will fight for them. And so they do that. They just worship God, and God comes and causes all these enemies to fight each other instead of fighting Judah. And so Judah gets victory. The bad thing about Jehoshaphat, though, is that he made this military alliance with King Omri and then his son, King Ahab. And they made this alliance because, remember, because of what Asa had done, both Israel and Judah were now paying taxes to Aram, in that nation in the north. And so they want to make this alliance to help them beat Aram so they don't have to pay taxes to them anymore. So, but because of this was a really bad thing. Hananiah's son, who was a seer called Jehu, comes to Jehoshaphat and criticizes him, but he also encourages him for his devotion to Yahweh. And unlike his father, he doesn't put Jehu in prison. He actually humbles himself, but he doesn't change his behavior permanently either. What he did, basically, is he took King Ahab's daughter, who was Athaliah, as a wife for his son and heir, and this is going to become King Jehoram. But after Ahab's death, he distanced himself, Jehoshaphat distanced himself from the northern kingdom. But sadly, then, he turns back again and makes this new alliance with King Ahaziah, which is Ahab's son, so that he could build this powerful fleet of ships to go to Europe. And because of that, another prophet named Eliezer proclaims God's judgment on him, and the whole fleet of ships gets destroyed. And then in this alliance that he made with the northern kingdom lasted for 4 generations. And because of it, David's whole family line is going to be almost totally wiped out. So it's a big deal that Jehoshaphat did this. It was a big, stupid thing to do. It made sense politically at the time because they're trying to get free from Aram, but it was a bad thing. And it really gave Israel more power than they should have had over Judah, as we're going to see with Athaliah. Remember that name, Athaliah. So at the end of his life, Jehoshaphat fought next to King Joram of Israel. After King Uzziah, he dies. He doesn't last very long. And then Joram becomes king, his brother. And then they fight against this Moabite king, and they're forced to retreat. The Moabites win. So there's not so much of a good ending with Jehoshaphat. And then his son, King Jehoram, reigns. And he's really evil. He's married to Athaliah, who's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel from Israel. And he was the firstborn of many brothers, but at the beginning of his reign, he kills all his other brothers and acts just like his father-in-law, King Ahab. He sets up high places to worship and worship many other gods, and he built this temple for Baal and established a priesthood for Baal in Judah, just like Ahab and Jezebel had done in Israel. And so Elijah, the prophet who we talked about, wrote this letter to King Jehoram declaring God's judgment on him, but also that God was still going to be faithful to David despite the fact that his descendant Jehoram was acting evil. An interesting note about this is the only written document that we have from Elijah in the Bible. So Elijah did write letters apparently, but this is one that we have. The only one we have in the Bible. And so, because of what Jehoram does, God begins faithfully judging him by humbling the kingdom of Judah and taking away their power in the land. First, the Edomites rebel because Judah controlled the Edomites who were south of them. And then the people of Libnah rebel. And then finally, this coalition of Philistines and Arabs unite, and they take away all the land of Judah south of Jerusalem. They also invade Jerusalem and ravage the city, but they don't conquer it. Jerusalem was almost wiped out If they wanted to, they could have, but they just didn't want Jerusalem. It wasn't valuable to the Philistines and Arabians. So they left that. But they did take all his wives. All of King Jehoram's wives were taken except Athaliah, the evil one, Ahab's daughter. He left Athaliah. And then all his sons were killed in this war except his youngest son, Ahaziah. And Yahweh struck him with a horrible digestive disease at the end of his life that was so painful and horrible that at the very end of his life, how he dies is his bowels just burst open and he dies. And no one mourns his death, and the people refused to bury him in the royal tombs. And so he was separated from all the other kings. And it's because of all these bad things that he did. And his son Ahaziah becomes king after him. And so he's the daughter of Athaliah, the grandson of Ahab and Jezebel of Israel. But he's reigning again over Judah. So he was the only remaining eligible descendant of David to become king, even though he was the youngest and least likely to be the heir, because all the others were taken away by the Philistines and Arabians. So led by his mother, Athaliah, he followed in the paths of his grandfather, King Ahab, and his great-grandfather, King Omri of Israel. He continued the unholy alliance with the house of Omri over Israel, going to war with Aram with his uncle, King Joram. After they lost the war with Aram, he visited his uncle in Samaria because King Joram had been wounded in the war. But this visit would actually be his doom because God had declared judgment on the house of Omri, as we talked about, through this guy Jehu, who was a general over the Israelite military. And Jehu was anointed by God to carry out this judgment on Omri, but it's interesting because Jehu kills King Ahaziah of Judah with all the descendants of Omri. But Chronicles says that Jehu was wicked in doing this. So it's very interesting because Kings wouldn't make you think that Jehu was wicked completely. I mean, it does to an extent that he doesn't purify the golden calves, but there's a lot of good that he does. But he's just very violent, so it's focusing on that element of it here. But because what happens now is that Athaliah's son has just been killed, and she's furious because she was the last living descendant of Omri, the whole great royal dynasty over Israel. Omri had a great dynasty. And she's angry, so now she wants to destroy the house of David to make Judah feel the same thing that Israel was feeling. And so she starts killing her own grandchildren to try to wipe out all of David's descendants, which is just such wickedness and evil. And she also wanted Baal to be worshipped and not Yahweh. And so she was supported by this whole priesthood of Baal that her late husband had set up in the land, led by this high priest named Matan. They almost succeed in killing all of David's offspring, except that her daughter or stepdaughter, we're not really sure the exact relation, but this woman named Jehosheba, who was King Ahaziah's sister, she was married to the high priest, whose name was Jehoiada at this time. And she took one of the grandsons of Athaliah, one of her nephews, and hid him with Jehoiada in the neglected Jerusalem temple for 6 years, because at this point they weren't really using the Jerusalem temple, they were worshiping Baal. And so Jehoiada and the Levites in the land protected the last living descendant of David, and finally were able to establish him as the rightful king after 6 years of this reign of terror of Queen Athaliah. And Jehoiada, the Levites, and all the worshippers of Yahweh overthrew Athaliah, kill her, and kill all her supporters and the worshippers of Baal. And really, in this story, it's the high priest, Jehoiada, who's the hero, and his sons. And so they saved this descendant of David, who was King Jehoash, the last remaining descendant of David. And he was hidden as the last legitimate king and son of Ahaziah before Athaliah was trying to kill all her grandchildren. He was protected and anointed the new king by Jehoiada, his uncle, and Jehoiada, remember, was his uncle by marriage. With 2 wives, he repopulated the lineage of King David with many sons and daughters, led by his mentor and father figure, who was this high priest, Jehoiada. He worked hard to restore Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem and purify the people's worship in Judah. And Jehoiada was such a good guy that he lived to be 130 years old, and he was actually buried with the kings because of his righteousness. But sadly, this guy, King Jehoash, who was raised by Jehoiada and protected from his evil grandmother, he has this bad finish. After Jehoiada died, these corrupt government officials from Judah asked Joash to bring back the worship of Asherah and other idols into Judah. And he listened to them and helped them do this, and he neglected Yahweh's temple and started persecuting the Levites. And Jehoiada's son, Zechariah, so not the book of Zechariah, but another prophet named Zechariah, he came and prophesied against King Jehoash and this new government. And he commanded the people, King Jehoash was angry with Zechariah, and he commanded the people to stone Zechariah to death. And just think about the level of betrayal here, because Zechariah was the king's cousin. Zechariah's father raised the king, and he's the only reason the king was alive. And he totally betrayed this man of God and stoned him to death. And so because he did this, betraying his uncle, his cousin, and all the Levites, Yahweh turned against him in Judah, causing Aram to war against them and defeat them. And the war with Aram left him bedridden. His corrupt government despised him for losing to the nation of Aram, and they were tired of being a vassal, having to pay taxes to Aram. So they assassinated him when he was sick in his bed. And basically the theme of this is that his own treachery came back to him. Since his people hated him at the end, he was also not buried with the other kings of Judah. And his son that became king after him was Amaziah. The people chose Amaziah to be king after they assassinated his father. Well, actually, not all the government assassinated his father. Certain people in the government assassinated his father after many years of war between the priesthood and the royal elites. And the good people in the government actually avenged the death of Amaziah's father, killing the people who had assassinated him. But Amaziah himself was chosen by them to be the new king. He did what was right in God's sight, but not with a whole heart, it says. And so he was pressured to live up to the name of his ancestor, King David. He organized a huge military force, but he also hired 100,000 soldiers from the northern kingdom, from Israel, to fight for Judah. And this was not a good thing. This anonymous prophet from Judah spoke against his decision to hire the Israelite soldiers because Yahweh was against northern Israel. And King Amaziah dismissed them without giving them any reward. So the soldiers, he did good. He listened to the prophet, but all these Israelite soldiers are there. He says, actually, no, we don't need you, go home. And so they get angry about this. And so they go and ravage and raid all these cities in Judah. All these Israelites do this, which really makes Amaziah look bad, and it really makes Amaziah and all of Judah angry with Israel because this happened. So after this, Amaziah defeats this group of Edomites that come against the people, and he takes back the land of the Edomites for Judah. But then he sets up this idol that had come from the Edomites in Jerusalem. And it's not clear why he did this. It seems stupid to a lot of people, because why would you set up the idol of a god that whose people you defeated? It doesn't really make sense. It seems like a stupid thing to do. But my personal theory of it is that maybe he thought that he could control this, like it was a spiritual being he could control and like make it expand his power or something. I don't know. But for whatever reason, he set up this idol, and this anonymous prophet from Judah spoke against him for setting it up. And he refused to listen to the prophet and threatened him, said, "You better stop preaching this message to me." And so the prophet went away. And so then Amaziah becomes very prideful, and he plots to go to war against the northern kingdom because of what they did, how they ravaged all those cities in Judah. And he plans to take land, both for revenge for what the soldiers had done, but also to restore the glory of King David, because he wanted to live up to King David as a descendant of David. But despite being warned by the north, Israel saying, "You better not come to war against us because we're going to whoop your butt," he didn't listen. And so he declared war on King Joash, who was Jehu's grandson, and he tried to force the northern kingdom to surrender to his role as king over all Israel. And God humbled him with this humiliating defeat. He was taken captive by the king of the northern Israel, and he was a prisoner in Samaria until that king died, the king of Israel. But after this, Because of this humiliating defeat, Judah rejected Amaziah from being king over them. So he was set free from Samaria. He's like, okay, you can go back to your people now after the king of Israel died. But when he came back there, they had already chosen his son, Uzziah, to replace Amaziah. But Amaziah still had a small following, and he's like, I want to take back the kingdom for myself. So he ends up going to war with his own son, but he loses, and he runs away to this place called Lachish, where his son's supporters capture him and kill him. And so then King Uzziah, his son, is next. He's chosen by the people of the land, some sort of government group in the land, when he was only 16 years old, to replace his father, who had been taken captive to Samaria by northern Israel. Then I talked about how there was a civil war between him and his father, but he's the chosen king by the people and by God at this point, and Amaziah is rejected. And so Amaziah was declared a traitor and killed at Lachish after a battle. So once again, here's a king, Amaziah, who started off great, but had this bad ending. And so, as for Uzziah, Uzziah made a loose alliance with King Jeroboam II of Israel. And through this alliance, it wasn't like we're going to mix our bloodline. It was just like, you be king over there, I'll be king over here, and we'll kind of work together against our enemies. And because of this alliance, they become the most powerful political force in the land for that generation. They throw off the yoke of Aram, who is oppressing them, and they expand the borders of Judah in the south and Israel in the north to the place where David had them for the first time since David, though as two separate kingdoms. Also, Assyrian records confirm this outside the Bible, and they mention Uzziah by name as one of the kings who reigned over this great territory at that time. And so, like his father, Uzziah did what was right in God's sight. Mostly, he was counseled and supported by another different prophet named Zechariah, also not the book and not the other prophet. So there's 3 prophets Zechariahs, but one of them wrote a book, and that one's not till much later. But then later, he's also supported by Isaiah. Isaiah starts his ministry during Uzziah's time. And so he conquered the land of the Philistines, adding port cities along the Mediterranean coast to the kingdom of Judah, which opens up trade with all of Europe and the Mediterranean coast and North Africa. And then the Ammonites and much of the territory from the Arabians and other lands. He also conquered these lands and brought them in. And he conquered lands all the way to the border of the land of Egypt. And then he built up an extremely powerful military and was famous all over his part of the world during his reign. But because of all these things, once again, we have a bad finish. Strong start, bad finish. His success made him prideful, and so he tried to replace the Levite role of high priest and become a priest king for Yahweh, because other nations at that time, they didn't have a separate priest and a separate king. It was the same thing. So he's like, I can do that too. The Levites told him, you shouldn't do that. Like, God chose us to be the priests. And he becomes furious with the Levites and doesn't listen and says, no, I have the right to do this. And so he illegally starts serving as the high priest in the temple, and he's in the middle of offering the sacrifice, and then Yahweh strikes him with leprosy as judgment for his pride, because he lifts himself above God's authority in choosing the Levites. And because of this, he's a leper in the temple. He runs out, and the people rush him out, and he's forced to step down from his position, not only as trying to be a priest, but also as king, because he was a leper. And so he had to live with this skin disease and leprosy, separated from everyone else for the rest of his life. And then his son becomes king in his place. And that's King Jotham. And so he became king when his father became a leper, like I said. He learned from his father's mistake and did not repeat it. So Jotham did humble himself. He did what was right in God's sight throughout his entire life. But sadly, the book says, Chronicles says, the majority of the people of Judah continued to act wickedly and do things that they shouldn't do. But Jotham himself was good throughout his whole reign. He didn't have a bad finish. He was just good throughout. He built up Jerusalem more and built more cities in Judah, and God gave him victory over his enemies, and he defeated the Ammonites who tried to rebel against him. But, sadly, he was the last king of Judah to be totally independent from foreign powers. Because Judah had on and off been vassals, right? They were vassals to Egypt for just one generation with Rehoboam. And then for a couple generations, they were vassals to Aram. But they were independent now because of Uzziah, and now Jotham inherited that independence. But now, the Assyrians are starting to rise up, the Assyrian Empire, right? And that is causing others to just start making all these conflicts and trying to force this giant alliance against Assyria. But Judah didn't want to be a part of that. They just wanted to do their own thing. And so what happens is northern Israel and Aram start coming against Judah and pressuring him to pick a side, choose Assyria or choose us. But Jotham doesn't pick a side, but because of that, they start taking away territory from Judah, just on the outskirts and stuff. And so Judah starts shrinking. And then his son is King Ahaz. Ahaz becomes king. And in the same political situation, the government is kind of disgruntled because they're like, well, if Jotham was so good in telling us not to worship other gods and doing these right things, why are we losing land in all this situation that's happening? And so the government of Judah pressures his son Ahaz to seek other gods beside Yahweh. Maybe we'll do better if we worship other gods. And maybe we can get back to being powerful in the land. And so he went along with them. Ahaz went along with them. He followed the example of northern Israel and established worship of Baals in Judah again, along with many other Canaanite practices, including the disgusting worship of Molech, which is burning child sacrifice, burning to this god Molech. Burning sons as a child sacrifice. And so Yahweh judged Judah by causing the anti-Assyrian alliance of Aram and northern Israel to come down against Judah and ravage their land, way worse than they did with his father Jotham. And they carried away all these Jewish people as captives to northern Israel and to Aram. But then God sends this prophet named Oded from Judah, who declares that God was judging Judah for worshiping other gods under Ahaz. But Oded warned Aram and Israel that Yahweh would likewise judge them for their own evil. And so because of this, the northern Israelites humbled themselves and they returned their captive Jewish brothers back to Judah. And instead of seeking Yahweh for help with Aram and Israel when they attacked Judah, so instead of humbling himself, Ahaz seeks help from the Assyrian Empire and from other gods. So he basically goes to Assyria and says, we'll be a vassal to you. We'll serve your empire and pay you taxes if you help us with these other. It was so stupid. Because he did this, Judah is now forever going to be a vassal to one empire or another, except very briefly during Josiah's time. So he made Judah a vassal to the Assyrian Empire. They had to pay taxes to Assyria and give them tribute, land and money, and probably people as well to fight in Assyria's wars and stuff like that. So he helped the Assyrian Empire rise up and conquer Aram and the northern kingdom of Israel. So really, Ahaz is kind of part of the reason why the northern kingdom of Israel got completely wiped out by the Assyrians, and Aram as well. But then, after the Assyrians conquer Aram and Israel, they turn and ravage many cities in Judah. And they took over much territory in Judah, surrounding the most fortified cities. And despite all these things, King Ahaz did not seek Yahweh for help, but he built idols to the gods of Aram and asked for their help. And he built more high places to seek other gods for help. And then not only this, he shuts the doors of Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, and he doesn't let anyone worship Yahweh there. He tried to force all the Jewish people to worship the Baals and other gods, and he neglected the Levites. And by the end of his life, the people hated him, Chronicles says, and they wouldn't bury him with the other kings when he died. But his son, King Hezekiah, is another story, one of the best kings ever, the best king since David or Solomon. So as soon as he became king, Hezekiah opened the doors of Yahweh's temple, and he reestablished the proper worship using the services of the Levites once again. And immediately after this, when they purified the temple, he led all of Judah and many from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, specifically the Israelites from Asher, Manasseh, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Issachar, to observe a second Passover celebration because they had missed the first Passover, so they celebrated in the second month. And many people come from the north. By this time, Assyria wipes out the north, so there is no more northern kingdom. And many Israelites come to settle in Judah under Hezekiah just as a safe place from Assyria when this happens. And Hezekiah is still a vassal to Assyria, but he's doing his own thing, and they're not really interfering as long as he's paying them taxes. So it says that there was no Passover like this since the time of King Solomon, but it's not as good as the Passover that's going to come in Josiah's time. But it's still a great Passover. They actually make it last 2 weeks, because normally Passover only lasts a week. After this celebration, he led the people to destroy all the objects of forbidden worship in Judah and in northern Israel also. But by this time, northern Israel was again part of the Assyrian Empire. There was no more northern kingdom. So Yahweh was gracious to Judah during Hezekiah's time, and it says that Yahweh gave them one heart, total unity to serve him. And many Israelites joined the Jewish people. And he settled many Israelite refugees in Judah, like I was saying, refugees who were coming from the north. He put them in Jerusalem. He made Jerusalem bigger in this process, but he also put them in the lands all around Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah. And when the Assyrians came to siege and destroy Jerusalem, Yahweh does this miracle and saves Jerusalem, sending an angel to wipe out the Assyrian army. The Assyrian king was forced to go back to his home, where he was killed by one of his sons. Yahweh gave him great wealth and expanded the city of Jerusalem and renovated their source of water through Hezekiah. And when Hezekiah became sick, Yahweh miraculously healed him, but it says that sadly he did not fully honor God for this, for healing him, and he was prideful, self-righteous. At the end, in his pride, he invited men from Babylon to come meet with him. And if we look behind the scenes as to what's happening here, Babylon at this time were plotting rebellion and war against Assyria. And Hezekiah invites them and says, hey, come check out all this wealth and treasure that God gave me. Like, he shows them the temple and all this stuff, and he's like, and we can be friends, and we're going to take down Assyria, but don't tell him I said that, because he's supposed to be loyal to Assyria, Hezekiah, right? Because of what his father did. But he's trying to make this covenant with Babylon. And so because of this, it made the Babylonians be like, hey, here's a rich place. There's a lot of riches here. We should come back here someday and try to get some of this wealth for ourselves. And so God declares that one day the Babylonians are going to do this. They're going to try to come and take over Jerusalem, but not in Hezekiah's time. And so Hezekiah's like, oh good, it's not going to happen when I'm alive. And so as for relating again to historical records, despite his personal greatness, King Hezekiah was still a vassal to the Assyrian Empire. He paid them taxes. But like all vassals, he didn't want to be. And his people didn't like that. They didn't want to pay taxes to Assyria. So they were looking for an opportunity to rebel against the Assyrians. So he allied with Babylon. King Hezekiah was the leader of this massive conspiracy. Hezekiah's name is actually mentioned in the Assyrian records, that there was this conspiracy against the Assyrian Empire. And he rallied a whole network of Egyptians and Philistines and Phoenicians, that's the coastal Canaanites, and many other vassals of Syria to orchestrate this big rebellion that spanned across the entire Assyrian Empire. And although it took precious time and resources, the Assyrians crushed this rebellion completely. And in retaliation for what Hezekiah did in betraying them, the Assyrians turned and ravaged the entire land of Judah. Almost everything around the capital city of Jerusalem was destroyed and reduced to ruins. And so this that I'm telling you here is not in Chronicles, but it is in the Assyrian records. It's in archaeology. We can see it in all this stuff. So the Bible focuses on the good parts, though. So the Bible focuses on Jerusalem was saved, and that's true. Jerusalem was miraculously saved. We can't explain how that happened. But thousands of Israelite refugees who were settled around Jerusalem were carried off to Babylon as exiles by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians tried to destroy Jerusalem also, but they just failed because of God's grace and the miracle that God did. But why am I telling you this? Because so you can understand Manasseh better. So Hezekiah's son Manasseh becomes king, and then the people of Judah are wondering, why would Yahweh allow Judah to be totally humiliated in this way, even though Jerusalem, yes, was miraculously saved? If Hezekiah had really done the right things spiritually, then why was Judah so weak and pathetic? So people are thinking that after Hezekiah dies, and this is when Manasseh becomes king. And as you recall, King Manasseh followed the popular opinion and rejected pure worship of Yahweh with hope that worshiping all other gods would lead to prosperity for Judah. When Manasseh became king, the kingdom of Judah was still a vassal of the Assyrian Empire, but now under a new king. Because remember, Assyria was starting to have some chaos. When that king went home after he couldn't conquer Jerusalem, his own son, or a group of his own sons maybe, killed him, and they started this civil war in Assyria. But in the midst of all this chaos, Manasseh is still vassal of Assyria. Even though the royal family of Assyria is divided, they went into this horrible period of civil war, which actually would eventually lead the Assyrian Empire to collapse. But in the meantime, there was this new king over Babylon who was an Assyrian king, but he was against his brother, who was the king of all the other provinces. So basically, this guy who's over Babylon is networked with Manasseh and wants Manasseh to help try to overthrow his brother who's over Assyria, who's from Babylon. So this will all connect in a minute, but just so hopefully you're getting what I'm saying on that point. So King Manasseh was pressured to support both sides of this conflict, this Assyrian civil war, one led in Babylon, and it wasn't the Babylonians, it was Assyrian rule over Babylon, a brother of the king's, one of the king's sons, and then the other son was over Nineveh, right, or the other side. So Manasseh is pressured on both sides to support both of them, and his authority was under constant threat by the Assyrians. And so, to show his loyalty, King Manasseh made the people of Judah pay heavy taxes to help them build a new palace in Nineveh for the Assyrians, because he's trying to show loyalty. But then King Manasseh also forced military from Judah to help the Assyrian Empire conquer Egypt, which many people from Judah, many Jewish people died fighting in this war. It wasn't even their war, it was an Assyrian war. And then the people of Judah tried to overthrow King Manasseh because he became seen as an evil tyrant. But he brutally put down all rebellions, torturing and executing all known conspirators with this Assyrian style of brutality. And despite this, the Assyrians did not trust King Manasseh because of the way his father had allied with Babylon against them. Hezekiah was trying to network with Babylon, remember. So the Assyrians captured him and threatened him by taking him to Babylon to ensure his faithfulness to them. And King Hezekiah was found loyal, so they released him and allowed, did I say Hezekiah? King Manasseh, not Hezekiah. King Manasseh was found loyal, so they released him and allowed him to continue serving them as king of Judah. Now to the Bible part of King Manasseh. So hopefully that just adds more context into why would Manasseh do what he did. So if you recall, I talked about when we talked about kings, Manasseh was the most evil king that Judah ever had. He led the people to forsake Yahweh and worship all the gods around the ancient world. Like it says, all the host of heaven. So any god they could worship, they were worshiping them. He set up idols in the temple in Jerusalem. And Yahweh sent many seers and prophets to call Manasseh and his government to repentance, but they would not listen, and they were killing the prophets. They even killed the prophet Isaiah by sawing him in two. This is not directly stated in the Bible, but the New Testament references someone sawn in two, and it was probably Isaiah, because there's a Jewish writing that says that Manasseh did this to Isaiah. So in judgment, Yahweh sent the Assyrian king to capture Manasseh, and this is again in the Bible, and take him in chains and with a hook in his nose to Babylon. There in Babylon, as an Assyrian prisoner, King Manasseh repented. And this part we did not hear about in Kings. So he was the most evil king, but God allows him to be judged by taken as a prisoner to Babylon, and then he repents, and he begs for Yahweh's forgiveness and compassion. And so Yahweh delivers him from the Assyrians in Babylon, and he returns him to Jerusalem. And when he gets back, he leads the people to put away and throw out all the idols. They don't destroy them, but they just toss them aside. And all the other gods, and only worship Yahweh. And so for the very end of his reign, it says that the people only worship Yahweh. However, they don't get rid of the high places. They just worship Yahweh at the high places in addition to Jerusalem. But they didn't worship any other gods except Yahweh at the end of Manasseh's time. So he starts off as the most evil king that Judah ever has, but then by the end he turns it all around. So he's bad start, strong finish. For Manasseh. And he fortified the city of Jerusalem to make it stronger against potential invaders, because Jerusalem is starting to feel like, wow, people want to conquer us. So, which was true. Manasseh's son was this guy named King Amon. And interestingly, the name Amon is the name of an Egyptian god, which is strange. But it's probably because Amon was born during that time when his father's army had helped the Assyrians conquer Egypt, because Manasseh had to do that as an Assyrian vassal. And Amon brought back the idols that his father had thrown out. He brought them all back in, and he led the people in forsaking Yahweh and worshiping the idols again. He was prideful and he never humbled himself like his father had done. He remained loyal to Assyria and kept Judah as a vassal kingdom, paying taxes to Assyria. Government leaders in Judah who were loyal to Egypt assassinated him, connected to an Egyptian conspiracy plot to use Judah as a pawn against Assyria. Because at this point, the Assyrians had conquered Egypt, but Egypt had been this mighty, powerful empire in the distant past, and they wanted their freedom back. So then this group called the people of the land, who were patriots loyal to Judah, captured and killed the government leaders who assassinated this king, Amon. And they chose his son Josiah to become the new king. And Josiah also remains loyal to Assyria, but in the middle of Josiah's reign, Assyria falls, the empire collapses, and so there's no more Assyria, and Josiah and Judah are free. And so King Josiah, the statement with him is not as strong in Chronicles as it was in Kings, because remember in Kings it says he was the best king ever, even better than King David. Well, it didn't say that specifically, but it was implied in the way it worded. But in 2 Chronicles it says, "And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh and walked in the ways of his father David and did not turn aside to the right or to the left." And so during his reign, the Assyrian Empire fell, which left this massive power vacuum all over the land. Both the Babylonians in the northeast and the Egyptians in the southwest began to rise up and try to reestablish their ancient empires. King Josiah used this opportunity to expand the kingdom of Judah northward into former territory of the northern kingdom of Israel. He actually goes all the way and takes control of Samaria. So Josiah now controls Samaria as part of Judah. But that used to be the capital of the north before Assyria had it. And so then he also expands westward to the port cities on the Mediterranean Sea, and he hired Greek soldiers to help support his military. And based on many different political factors, King Josiah was pressured to create an empire in the Near East like David had done. And in many ways, he succeeded. It seems many in Judah's government wanted him to do this through an alliance with Babylon against the Egyptians. Because, again, there's this power vacuum in the land, and Judah's this kind of small territory in the middle of it. And Josiah started to expand, do all these great things, right? Move the empire. But the big players are now Egypt and Babylon. Assyria's gone, and they're both trying to become the main empire now. And there's pressure to support one or the other. Support Babylon or Egypt. And this is going to be for the rest of Judah's history now. But meanwhile, while all this is going on, Josiah has this heart to seek Yahweh only and to return Judah to pure worship. And so he leads this revival with help from the high priest, whose name was Hilkiah, who was Jeremiah's father, the prophet Jeremiah. And they found the book of the covenant of Torah written by Moses that was lost somewhere, hidden in the temple. King Josiah establishes the Levites once again, and he purifies Yahweh's temple for the worship that God wants. And then he reads the Torah to all the Israelites, all the Jewish people, really, but that included all 12 tribes who were in Judah by this time, the remnant of the tribes. And so this was the greatest revival in the history of Israel. It enforced obedience to the Torah of Moses, no other gods, and everything else too. It destroyed Jeroboam's golden calves at both Dan, all the way up there, and Bethel, because remember, Josiah expanded the territory. He was able to do that, so he had control of that in a loose way. And he destroyed all the shrines to other gods throughout the entire northern territory of Israel, because he was able to get in there. And then he celebrated the Passover with the correct protocols at the right time, for the first time since Samuel was alive, which was about 400 years. So despite this great revival in Judah, Yahweh decided to discipline Judah by destroying Jerusalem for the sins of the Jewish people and forsaking him and worshiping other gods for so long. The prophetess called Huldah declared Yahweh's judgment on Judah to Josiah, but she also declared that Yahweh would not do this while Josiah was alive. Sadly, at the very end, Josiah does have this act of disobedience that leads to his doom. As with former kings, he had a lot of pressure to be politically great like David and create this empire. The Egyptians were becoming more powerful, and they had the potential to establish a new empire in the land also. So the only thing was, though, they had to defeat the Babylonians. So if the Egyptians could defeat the Babylonians, the Egyptians would be the new empire. So again, the people in Judah were divided. Should we support Egypt or should we support Babylon? Because we're right in the middle of their war. Or really, you could think of it as a Cold War probably at this time, but it was escalating into a full-on war. So backed by much of the government in Judah, Josiah supported the Babylonians and stood against the Egyptians, who were rushing across Josiah's territory to fight with Babylon. And so basically the Egyptians are going through Judah to fight with Babylon, and Josiah rides out and says, hey, what are you doing here? But God warned Josiah through messengers of the Egyptian Pharaoh, whose name was Necho at this time, that he needed to get out of the way and let the Egyptians fight the war with Babylon without interfering. But Josiah did not listen. And the way Chronicles presents this is like the Pharaoh knows, it's my destiny to fight with Babylon and you just need to get out of the way. But Josiah doesn't listen. He tries to get involved in the situation. And so because of this, Josiah disguises himself and tries to secretly fight with Egypt. But in this process, Pharaoh Necho kills Josiah. He wounds him fatally. And so this leads to chaos in Judah for the rest of their existence. And during Josiah's reign, Judah only had freedom very briefly. And that leads to the very last kings that go by very quickly. First, Jehoahaz, who's Josiah's son. Jehoahaz was not the firstborn son of Josiah, but he was the son of Josiah who supported the alliance between Judah and Babylon. And so he only reigned over Judah for 3 months before the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho captured him and carried him to Egypt as a prisoner. And then the same Pharaoh Necho, who was the one who killed his father, forced the people of Judah to pay him an extremely heavy tax and installed Josiah's firstborn son, whose name was Eliakim, as the new king of Judah. And that brings us to King Jehoiakim. And this was the king who supported the wicked priests and false prophets in the land. He cut up and burned the original scroll, Jeremiah's prophecies, and he tried to kill Jeremiah as well. But he was the firstborn son of the former King Josiah. His birth name was different, but Pharaoh Necho changed his name from Eliakim to Jehoiakim. And again, he supported Egypt, so that's why he was chosen. But because of him, Judah now becomes a vassal to Egypt. He did evil in God's sight, acting prideful and refusing to accept Yahweh's discipline and surrender to Babylon. And he supported the Egyptians against the Babylonians in the land, and he conspired against those in Judah who favored Babylon over Egypt. He was a vassal of Egypt, basically a puppet king, and he forced the people of Judah to pay taxes to Egypt, like I said. When the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho was defeated by the Babylonian, King Nebuchadnezzar defeated Pharaoh Necho. Then King Jehoiakim was forced to switch his pledge of loyalty from Egypt to Babylon unwillingly. He didn't want to do this, but he was forced. So when he thought Egypt could make a comeback against Babylon, Jehoiakim decides, let's rebel against King Nebuchadnezzar, which leads to the first siege of Jerusalem. I didn't explain this when we went over Lamentations last week, but in those days, cities had walls to protect them from invasions, right? And so what the armies would do is they'd have a siege, which is where the army surrounds the walls. They don't let any food get in, any water, any help. So it starves the people, it makes them thirsty, it makes the people want to just surrender and open the gates and let the people in. So that's what they would do. So this is the first time Jerusalem now gets sieged by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the government of Judah is so angry with Jehoiakim for letting this happen that they kill Jehoiakim and throw his body over the wall and say, Nebuchadnezzar, we surrender, you win. And so Nebuchadnezzar makes Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, the new vassal king of Judah in service to Babylon. But at this time, King Nebuchadnezzar also exacts a tax on Judah by taking the first round of exiles from Judah to Babylon. And Daniel, the prophet Daniel, was one of these who was taken at this time. And so then we have King Jehoiachin. He's the last legitimate king of Judah, and the future Messiah is going to come. Jesus is going to come from his line. He was taken into exile where they treated him well, and he established this lineage from King David called the Exilarchs, the royal seed of David. But he was only 8 years old when he became king, and he was really just a puppet for all the other powers that were at the time. But he reigned over Judah for just 3 months and 10 days, and he was a puppet king for Babylon and the competing political parties in Judah, which was, again, the pro-Babylonian people and the pro-Egypt people. Because there was really, they couldn't really be independent. They needed to rely on one or the other. So influenced by the evil pro-Egypt group, Jehoiachin, and how he was 8 years old, I mean. But influenced by the evil pro-Egyptian group, he led Judah to rebel against Babylon again.
Yeah, let's listen to the 8-year-old.
What are you going to do? But I mean, he
Probably did
wasn't...
more than Biden.
If you're 8 years old, how much power do you really have? Think about it. So, but there's this evil group that's pro-Egypt, and so they rebel again. And so because of this, King Nebuchadnezzar responds by taking him. Obviously, he's an 8-year-old boy, so Nebuchadnezzar, that's probably why he had compassion on him and treated him well in exile. But he takes him and many more people from Judah into exile, and this is the second round of exiles. And then King Nebuchadnezzar makes his uncle, Zedekiah, who was also a son of Josiah, but not one that would have been king. But he makes Zedekiah the new vassal king of Judah and serves to Babylon. And so Zedekiah then is the last king, but he's an illegitimate heir and the uncle of the true king, who was Jehoiakim. And in Babylon, it seems that Jehoiachin was still recognized as the true king by those that were exiles in Babylon. But back in Judah, they actually, even in Judah, it seems like nobody wanted Zedekiah when you look into the lines, which is just sad, because he wasn't really a legitimate heir. He was like the last-born son of Josiah. It just didn't make sense, because Josiah's grandson had already been the new king. But he betrayed Babylon. His ending is terrible. I talked about it last time. But he did evil in God's sight by supporting false prophets and corrupt priests, refusing to humble himself and listen to the message of the prophet Jeremiah, to submit to Yahweh's discipline using Babylon. And caught between the powers of Babylon in the far northeast and the Egyptians in the immediate southwest, and with pressure from those left in Judah, he chose to support Egypt and rebel against Babylon like those before him. He broke his oath to King Nebuchadnezzar because he had promised to never break the oath, and he paid the highest price. Jerusalem city and Yahweh's first temple, which is Solomon's temple, the one Solomon built, were destroyed. All the remaining most influential people in Judah were taken into exile. This is the third and final round of exiles. People from Judah carried away to Babylon. And the Babylonians killed his entire family in front of him and then blinded him. I talked about that last time. And so there's the temple burning down. There's Zedekiah being bound and carried off after they blinded him. And there's all the most influential Jewish people are taken out of the land. Only the poorest, the ones the Babylonians would have seen as the losers in the land, are left behind in Judah. Everyone else is taken into exile in Babylon. And remember, in Lamentations, this is what Jeremiah is mourning over when he sees all these horrible things that happen connected with this. This is a map of where they were taken. Judah's all the way over here. Egypt was down here that was pressuring them into Babylon over here. So they carried the people from Judah all the way to Babylon, and then the Jewish people actually spread out once they're forced to live over there in that part of the empire. So for 70 years, this is how Chronicles ends. For 70 years, the Babylonian Empire is in power, mostly with King Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't last long after Nebuchadnezzar's gone. And I never talked about this, but Nebuchadnezzar does repent in the book of Daniel. You guys have probably read that before, I'm sure. I won't go into that story now, although it is a really cool story about Nebuchadnezzar. But the vassal kingdom of Judah, during this time, the Babylonian Empire, it became the Babylonian province of Judea. So it's no longer a kingdom, it's now a province of an empire. And so Judea would now have governors that were chosen by the empire and not kings. Governor Gedaliah is the first governor, and they moved the capital because Jerusalem was totally destroyed, so they moved it to Mizpah, this other place in Judea. And Gedaliah is the governor, but a group of rebels led by the lesser Jewish nobility, so they were actually descendants of David, but they would never be king. They were just lesser nobility. And they conspire to kill the governor Gedaliah and run away to establish Jewish communities in the land of Egypt. And they're like, no, we're with Egypt forever. So they leave Judea and go to Egypt, and they forced Jeremiah to come with him. I talked about that. But the poorest Jewish people stayed in the province of Judea and lived as farmers. And so this is the beginning of what's called the Jewish Diaspora, which is the scattering of the Jewish people all over the world. They're still the poorest who are left in the land, and then there's a community in Egypt, those rebels that supported Egypt. There's those who are in exile in Babylon, a big majority of them over here. And there's many that also move in different directions now, even going as far as Europe, other places in North Africa, and up there into what would now be Turkey. And this is the true origin of Judaism. Jews scattered all over the world. They're going to establish synagogues, and they're not going to worship idols anymore. They're going to really be strict about only one God, only worship one God. And eventually the Persian Empire is going to overthrow the Babylonian Empire, which is going to lead to a new era that is going to be the end of the Old Testament story, is this era. And so this is the strange ending of the book of Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles 36, verse 23, it says, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia." So this guy Cyrus has now overthrown Babylon, and Persia is now the empire over all the land. "So thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may Yahweh his God be with him, and let him go up." And it ends with an incomplete sentence. That's a strange way to end a book, but it's intentional. The idea is that the Jewish people are in exile in all these foreign lands, and the book of Chronicles is inviting the Jewish people to remember their heritage of all these kings and have hope in returning to their homeland. But this would force them to leave the lands that they've become used to and to come back and rebuild God's temple and remember God and return. And that's the end of Chronicles. So going forward, we're going to talk about the end of the Old Testament in two different Jewish situations. There's Jewish people who are still in exile and what their life is like in exile. And then there's Jewish people who are in exile. Is just a term that means away from your homeland. But really these Jews, it's not like they feel like they're in exile. Many of them, they want to be there now because they make new homelands. But then you also have Jews that want to return to their homeland, and they're going to get to do that under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we're going to talk about that at the end of the Old Testament story. But as for the end of Chronicles, I'll just comment that the truth is, humanity was created to be in God's presence, which was the Garden of Eden in the beginning. And since we're not there, our whole lives on this earth are like an exile. We are not home here. This is not our home. And one day we will return home. But God invites us to return home now, to return to him, to repent, and to come back to him. And the ending of Chronicles is reminding us of God's goodness and his faithfulness, despite all the chaos around us in the world, and despite sin, even in our own lives, God is still faithful, and he's inviting us to return home to him, and not to be comfortable in our state of exile, in our state of this world, but to remember our true home in Eden, in the Garden of Eden with him, in heaven and paradise with him. So Lord, thank you so much for opening a way for us to return home to you. Lord, help us not to be comfortable in this temporary exile that we are in on this earth. You are bringing heaven. You are bringing our true home to this earth. Prepare our hearts to receive you in the true home you have for us, our true home with you. In Jesus' name, amen.